Thank you, Aditi. Your Holiness, Mr. Dover, Mr. Vijay Kranti, and Mr. Vikas Arya, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Our director, Ajit, has spelled out the civilizational aspects that tie India and Tibet together and what make Tibet so important for us. I think the civilizational ties really are unique, they stand alone, and through history, the two civilizations have had a mutually reinforcing relationship. When we have been in trouble, they have preserved the heritage. When they have faced difficulties, we have chipped in. That's one of the defining characteristics of the relations between our two countries. Tibet, of course, is important for at least two other reasons. The first of these two is the security aspect. Tibet, the status of Tibet and the nature of the power that rules from Lhasa are very important factors in India's security. This is one of the themes that this book has examined fairly closely, and it's sad to reflect upon the way this particular aspect was completely lost sight of when the Tibetan events were taking place in the late 40s and the early 50s. The second way in which Tibet is very important for us is that Tibet, as we now recognize very widely, is the water tower of Asia. And in this sense, what happens to the flow of the major rivers which rise in Tibet and feed pretty much all the rest of Asia are extremely important. We are already facing some of the difficulties, and this is one of the issues that we are talking to Beijing about, but there are other lower riparians as well, and I think this is something which is beginning to agitate them too. So these are two other ways in which Tibet is very important for us, and both these themes have been examined in some detail in the book. The origin of the book itself, actually, for many of us meaning diplomats and other government officials who have had to deal with this issue, is a sense of guilt, a kind of mea culpa, that we could have done much more in the late 40s and the early 50s, but failed to do so. To me, for instance, it's very ironic when I read the history. We referred Kashmir to the United Nations. We know that Nehru was contemplating taking the Hyderabad issue to the United Nations, but when it came to taking Tibet to the UN, Nehru was the one who opposed it tooth and nail. It's a very strange phenomenon which I, frankly, am not able to get my head around, because quite apart from the fact that there was a great deal of concern in some sections of international opinion, and some of the countries, not us, some of the other members of the UN had brought this issue to the UN. But a little earlier, in 1947, when Nehru first called the Asian Relations Conference, this was even before India formally became independent in August, Tibet had been invited as a separate country, as a sovereign country. This is 1947. And funnily enough, when the People's Republic was formed and the communists took power, we changed our position. This is quite incomprehensible, and especially because the earlier Republic of China regime had limited military presence in Tibet. We probably had a higher military presence in Tibet. The People's Republic took it over by purely military means, rammed a 17-point agreement down the throats of the Tibetan negotiators in Beijing. This was done under duress and very likely with forged seals. And yet, by 1954, we became the first country in history to recognize the sovereignty of China over Tibet. It's a chapter which is particularly inglorious, in my opinion, And some of the pain, some of the regret is also reflected in the pages of this book, where we have tried to bring out how we failed not just Tibet, which was bad enough, but how we compromised our own national security. And the culmination of those mistakes, of course, was 1962. The other point that we have brought out in the book is that despite all these mistakes, all is not lost. There are at least 3 issues on which the international community can and should engage in the Tibetan question. The first, of course, is the question of human rights. And there's a very detailed treatment of the issue of human rights in the book. You can just imagine that when a person immolates himself or herself, you can quite imagine the depths of despair that would drive a person to do so. And it is something which has been recorded, not just by the Tibetans, but by many Indians, many international organizations. And it's just one of those things that requires attention to be paid to it. That's one. The second, as I mentioned already, is the question of water. This is an issue which concerns India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, and several other Asian countries. It appears to me that this would be a kind of issue which we could fit into some kind of Asian dialogue. There are a number of examples of geometry within the Asian ASEAN framework, and it seems to me this topic would be quite appropriate to air and get a mutually acceptable settlement to this. As I said, we are already talking to Beijing ourselves. Certainly we can see about extending this dialogue to cover this issue in a multilateral framework. And the third, of course, probably the most important, and also probably the most forgotten, is that there is a 1961 General Assembly resolution, UN General Assembly resolution, calling for self-determination for Tibet. We had not voted in favor of this resolution when it was passed in 1961. But by 1965, when it was repeated, and a reference was made to the 1961 resolution, India had voted in favor. I am forced to note that this happened at a time when 61 was when Nehru was still alive, and 65 Nehru was no more. I'm just leaving this point for your consideration, but the fact is that there is this General Assembly resolution which we could work on. And of course, a General Assembly resolution does not have the same legal standing as a Security Council resolution, but let's also remember that the State of Israel was created by a General Assembly vote. So it isn't entirely devoid of any legal standing or any persuasive power. So these are the sorts of topics that we have broached in the book, and as Ajit ji mentioned, our idea is to put this issue to the public, raise the consciousness of this problem, and see about getting together to work for a settlement. Because I think the time is right, the situation demands it, and certainly we are all ready for it. With these words, I would like to commend the book to you. It remains for me to thank some people who have been involved in this. First and foremost, the team at VIF led by Ajit, my colleagues, I don't know if they are here, Neha Mehta and Orko Biswas. They worked very hard with me on getting the book into shape. And of course, all the contributors. My sincere thanks to all of them. And finally, thanks to all of you for taking the time to be present here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prabhatji. I think you have been able to introduce the book and also the subject and bring it to the focus. May I now request His Holiness to give us his blessings and guide us with his words.